The morning sun cast a golden hue over the city as David, dressed in his usual business attire, kissed his wife Elizabeth goodbye. "Another day at the office," he said with a practiced smile, masking the thrill of his secret plan. "Have a good day, love," Elizabeth replied, preoccupied with her own busy schedule. As David left their cozy apartment, he felt a surge of excitement, reminiscent of his childhood days when he would play truant from school. Once outside, David blended into the sea of commuters, his heart racing with anticipation. He walked a few blocks, ensuring he was out of sight, then doubled back towards home. The thrill of deception gave him an adrenaline rush. Upon re-entering the apartment, the familiar silence greeted him. He reveled in the thought of a day without deadlines or demands. "Ah, freedom," he whispered to himself, slipping off his shoes and tie. David wandered through the rooms, each step lightened by the absence of his family. He glanced at the family photos lining the walls, a reminder of his double life. In one photo, Elizabeth's smile seemed to hold a secret of its own, but David shrugged off the thought. Settling into his favorite armchair, he picked up a novel, but his mind wandered. He reminisced about his youthful escapades, the rush of hiding from his mother, the sanctuary of his childhood hideouts. Those were the days, he mused aloud, lost in nostalgia. As his mid-morning approached, David's stomach rumbled. He chuckled, realizing he had the freedom to eat whatever he pleased. Pizza for breakfast, why not? He thought, reaching for his phone to place an order. While waiting for his indulgent breakfast, David fired up his computer. Just a few hours of gaming, then maybe a nap, he planned, immersing himself in a world of digital adventures. The doorbell rang, snapping David back to reality. He hurried to collect his pizza, thanking the delivery person with a generous tip. "Enjoy your day off," the delivery person said with a wink, sensing David's secret. "Thanks, I will," David replied with a grin, closing the door behind him. He savored his pizza slice by slice, feeling like a king in his castle, free from the world's prying eyes. The hours passed in blissful solitude. David napped, played games, and even took a leisurely stroll around the apartment in his pajamas. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. As the afternoon sun began to wane, David prepared to resume his role as a dedicated husband and father. He cleaned up the evidence of his day's escapades, showered, and redressed in his business attire. In just a few more minutes of freedom, he sighed, taking one last look around the apartment. He then stepped out into the bustling city, ready to return to his life stage, where he played the part of a diligent worker and loving family man. Little did he know, his world was about to turn upside down. David, now back in his role as the family man, greeted Elizabeth and their two children, Emily and Michael, with a warm smile as they returned home. "How was everyone's day?" he asked, embracing each of them in turn. Elizabeth, a picture of efficiency and grace, shared stories of her day's successes at her high-powered job. "Meetings went well, and I've got a new project that's really exciting," she said, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. David listened, nodding and smiling, but his mind wandered back to his day of solitude. "That's great, Liz," he said, his tone genuine but distant. After dinner, as the children settled in their rooms, David found himself alone with his thoughts. He poured himself a drink and sat in his armchair, the same one where he had reveled in his freedom earlier. Elizabeth joined him, sitting across with her laptop. "Working late again?" David asked, a hint of concern in his voice. "Just wrapping up a few things," Elizabeth replied, her fingers dancing across the keyboard. David sipped his drink, reflecting on the stark contrast between their lives. Elizabeth, ambitious and successful, seemed to thrive in the chaos of her career. He, on the other hand, found solace in the predictability of his routine and the secret escape. "Sometimes, I wonder what life would be like if things were different," David said aloud, more to himself than to Elizabeth. Elizabeth looked up, curiosity in her gaze. "Different how?" she asked. David hesitated, then shared a sanitized version of his thoughts. "Maybe if I had taken a different career path, or if we lived somewhere else," he mused. Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. "We all have those what-if moments, David, but we've built a good life, haven't we?" she said, her tone reassuring. David smiled weakly. "Yes, we have," he agreed, but his heart wasn't in it. He knew their life was comfortable and stable. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Later that night, as David lay in bed next to Elizabeth, he thought about his day of truancy. He realized these secret retreats were more than just escapades. They were a manifestation of his longing for a life less ordinary. "I need to find what truly makes me happy," he whispered to himself, a sense of determination rising within him. But with this realization came a wave of guilt for keeping this secret from Elizabeth, the woman he had promised to share everything with. As sleep eluded him, David made a silent vow to rediscover himself, not just for his own sake, but for his family's as well. He wanted to be more than just the man who went through the motions. He wanted to be a man who lived with passion and purpose. The journey ahead would be challenging, but David knew it was one he needed to undertake. The next morning, David once again executed his deceptive routine. After the usual pleasantries and goodbyes, he watched Elizabeth and the children leave. Once certain they were gone, he circled back to the apartment, his mind already wandering to the day's indulgence. Unlocking the door, David was startled by voices. Confused, he stepped quietly inside, his heart racing. The apartment, which should have been his sanctuary of solitude, echoed with the sound of Elizabeth's voice. Curious and unnerved, David tiptoed towards the living room, where he found Elizabeth, still in her business attire, speaking fervently on the phone. He hesitated at the threshold, unseen. "No, you don't understand," Elizabeth said into the phone, her voice laced with frustration and sadness. "I'm tired of pretending everything is fine. I feel like I'm losing myself." David's heart sank. He had never heard Elizabeth speak like this. He was torn between revealing his presence and overhearing more. "I thought marrying David would be different, but it's like we're just going through the motions," Elizabeth continued, unaware of David's presence. "I feel like I'm living someone else's life." David felt as if the floor had dropped beneath him. His mind raced with confusion and hurt. This was a side of Elizabeth he had never seen, revealing a depth of unhappiness he had never imagined. "But what can I do?" Elizabeth sighed into the phone. "We have a family, responsibilities. I can't just change everything." David retreated quietly, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He needed time to process what he had just heard. He slipped out of the apartment, the door closing silently behind him. Outside, David wandered aimlessly, his planned day of leisure forgotten. Elizabeth's words echoed in his mind, each one a painful reminder of their strained relationship. "Is our marriage just a facade?" He wondered, his thoughts a tangled mess. He had always believed they were happy, or at least content. But now, he questioned everything he thought he knew about their life together. As the reality of Elizabeth's unhappiness settled in, David knew he couldn't ignore what he had overheard. It was a wake-up call, a painful revelation that something needed to change. But the question remained, what could he do to bridge the growing gap? Lost in thought, David didn't realize he had walked to a nearby park. He found a secluded bench and sat down, his mind racing with questions and fears about the future. He knew one thing for sure. He couldn't continue living in deception, both in his secret escapes and in his marriage. It was time for honesty and perhaps for difficult decisions. David returned home later that day, his mind still reeling from the morning's unexpected discovery. He found Elizabeth in the kitchen, her back turned, preparing dinner. The normalcy of the scene felt surreal to David, who was still grappling with her earlier words. "Hey," David said, trying to sound casual. "Smells good." Elizabeth turned, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just making spaghetti." "Your favorite?" she replied. They moved through dinner with the usual small talk, but David's mind was elsewhere. He watched Elizabeth, noticing the subtle signs of her discontent that he had missed before. The way she seemed distant, lost in thought, even as she conversed with the children. After dinner, Elizabeth excused herself to make a phone call. David seized the opportunity to eavesdrop, driven by a mix of guilt and a desperate need to understand. Hiding in the hallway, he listened as Elizabeth spoke, her voice tinged with a sadness that pierced his heart. "I don't know, Sarah," she said to her friend on the other end. "I just feel so trapped. I married David thinking we shared the same dreams, but now I'm not so sure." David felt a lump form in his throat. The pain of her words was almost too much to bear. "I love him. I do, but it's like we're living parallel lives. I've achieved so much in my career, but at home, I feel like I'm just going through the motions," Elizabeth continued. David's heart raced. He had never imagined Elizabeth felt this way. He had always seen her as the strong, unflappable pillar of their family. And David, Elizabeth sighed. He's a good man, but sometimes I feel like he's given up on his dreams. It's like he's just settled. And that scares me because I don't want to settle. I want passion, excitement, I want more. David withdrew quietly, his mind in turmoil. He felt a mix of empathy and defensiveness. He hadn't realized how deeply Elizabeth longed for more in their life together. Yet he also felt hurt that she hadn't shared these feelings with him. As he lay in bed that night, David realized the extent of their communication breakdown. They had become so caught up in the routine of daily life that they had stopped sharing their deepest fears and desires. David knew he had to confront these issues head-on. It was time for an honest conversation with Elizabeth, one that could potentially change the course of their marriage. The thought was daunting, but necessary. He needed to understand her needs and share his own, for the sake of their marriage and their shared future. The next morning, David resolved to bridge the gap between them. He approached Elizabeth with a newfound determination, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. "Elizabeth," he began, "we need to talk." David approached Elizabeth the next morning, his heart heavy but determined. He found her in the living room, lost in thought. The atmosphere was tense, charged with unspoken words. "Elizabeth, can we talk?" David's voice was steady, but his nerves were frayed. Elizabeth looked up, surprised. "Of course, David. What's on your mind?" David took a deep breath. "I overheard your conversation yesterday," he started, his voice trembling slightly. "About us, about our marriage." Elizabeth's expression shifted from surprise to concern. "David, please let me finish," David interrupted gently. "Hearing your words, it was like a wake-up call. I didn't realize you were so unhappy." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't mean for you to find out this way," she said softly. "I've been struggling with these feelings for a while. I just didn't know how to tell you." David sat next to her, his mind racing. "Why, Elizabeth? Why didn't you tell me you felt this?" "I was afraid," Elizabeth admitted. "Afraid of hurting you, of upsetting our life. And I guess deep down, I was afraid of facing the truth myself." David felt a pang of guilt. "I'm sorry, Elizabeth. I've been so caught up in my own world. I didn't see the signs. I've been complacent, and I've let you down." Elizabeth reached for his hand. "It's not just you, David. We both got lost along the way. We stopped communicating, stopped really seeing each other." David nodded, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for the pain they had both been silently enduring, and relief that it was finally out in the open. "I've been thinking a lot about my life, my career," David confessed. "I realize now I've been avoiding challenges, settling for the easy path, and that's not fair to you or to me." Or Elizabeth squeezed his hand. "What are you saying, David?" "I need to make some changes," David said, a newfound resolve in his voice. "For us, for our family. I want to be the man you deserve, the man I promised to be when we got married." Elizabeth's tears spilled over. "I want that too, David. I want us to be happy, truly happy." David hugged her, feeling a sense of hope amidst the uncertainty. "Let's start anew, Elizabeth. Let's rediscover ourselves, both as individuals and as a couple." They sat together in silence, united in their resolve to rebuild their relationship. It would be a journey, filled with challenges and growth, but they were ready to face it together. For the first time in a long time, David felt a sense of clarity about his life and his marriage. As they began to talk, really talk, about their hopes, fears, and dreams, David felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one filled with honesty, understanding, and renewed love. In the days that followed their heart-to-heart conversation, David and Elizabeth navigated a delicate dance of rediscovery and reconciliation. David, now keenly aware of the distance that had grown between them, was determined to bridge the gap. One evening, as they sat in their backyard under the starlit sky, David broached the subject that had been weighing heavily on his mind. "Elizabeth, I've been thinking a lot about what you said," David began, his voice tinged with vulnerability, "about how we've been living parallel lives." Elizabeth turned to him, her expression somber. "I meant what I said, David. I want us to find our way back to each other." David nodded, taking a deep breath. "I know I've been absent in more ways than one, and I want to change that. I've been considering going back to school to finally pursue my master's in engineering. It's something I've always wanted, and I think it's... Elizabeth's eyes widened in surprise. That's a big step, David. But what about your job, our finances? David reached for her hand. I know it won't be easy, but I can take evening classes, and I've looked into some scholarships and grants. I don't want to burden our finances any more than necessary. Elizabeth squeezed his hand, a mixture of admiration and concern in her eyes. I'm proud of you, David, for wanting to follow your dreams, but are you sure about this? I've never been more sure about anything, David replied, his determination clear. But this isn't just about me. This is about us, our future. I want to be someone you can be proud of, someone who contributes more to our family. Elizabeth leaned in, resting her head on his shoulder. I've always been proud of you, David, and I support you, but I want us to make these decisions together as partners. He wrapped his arm around her. Of course. This is a decision for both of us. I just want you to know that I'm committed to making changes for us, for our family. They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their thoughts. The decision before them was significant, but they were no longer at a standstill. They were moving forward together. Let's do it, Elizabeth finally said, a sense of resolve in her voice. Let's start this new chapter. But let's promise each other that we'll communicate, be honest about our feelings, and face challenges together. David smiled, a sense of peace settling over him. I promise, Elizabeth, we'll navigate this together. Their conversation marked a turning point. It was the beginning of a journey filled with challenges, but also with hope and renewed commitment. David and Elizabeth had reached a crossroads, and they chose the path of togetherness, armed with love and a shared vision for their future. Months had passed since David and Elizabeth embarked on their journey of rediscovery and healing. The changes in their lives were palpable, not just in their relationship, but in their individual selves as well. One evening, as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, Elizabeth spoke. Her voice reflective. These past months have been enlightening. I never realized how much we needed this change. David, who was now balancing his job with night classes, looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. It's been challenging, but I feel like I'm finally moving towards something meaningful. And it's all because we decided to face our issues together. Elizabeth smiled, reaching for his hand. And how do you feel about your course? Are you happy with your decision? David's face lit up. Absolutely. It's tough juggling work and studies, but every time I'm in class, I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be. It's reignited my passion for engineering. Elizabeth squeezed his hand. I'm so proud of you, David, and I'm glad we're doing this together. I've been doing some soul searching too. I've started that painting class I always talked about. It feels good to do something for myself. David turned to her, his expression soft. I love that you're exploring your own passions. It's important that we both find fulfillment, not just as a couple, but as individuals. They both looked out into the sunset, contemplating their journey. It hadn't been easy. There were days filled with doubts and struggles, but each challenge brought them closer, strengthening their bond. I was thinking, Elizabeth began, her tone tentative. Maybe we could start a new tradition. Once a week, we could have a date night or AI family adventure day, something to keep us connected. David loved the idea. That sounds perfect. Let's make sure we never lose sight of what's important, us, our family. As the night drew in, they continued to talk, planning and dreaming together. They had learned that change was not only possible but necessary for growth. Their path to self-discovery had not only brought them closer but had also allowed them to grow as individuals. As they stood up to head inside, David wrapped his arm around Elizabeth. We've come a long way, haven't we? We have, Elizabeth agreed, leaning into his embrace. And I wouldn't have it any other way. Their journey had taught them the importance of honesty, communication, and pursuing personal dreams. They had faced their crossroads and chosen a path that led to deeper understanding and love. It was a path they would continue to walk together, hand in hand, embracing whatever the future held.